Hey everybody, Lee Rumble here with TSU Extension Office in Knox County. We're out at Hope Central today and we're going to be pruning actually some fruit trees and a couple fruit bushes as well. Right here in front of me, of course, is a goumi berry. This is sort of a new plant for me. I've done a little bit of digging on it and apparently it's a wonderful prolific berry producer. And fairly easy to grow as well, but certainly this is what we would consider a neglected shrub. And that is certainly true of some of the other trees that we see around this area as well. Now, that's not uncommon. We see a lot of fruit trees that get planted early in life and then they get neglected for many, many years. So as arborists, we show up and we are left to kind of fix the problems of the past. Now, certainly that doesn't mean that it's not possible to do that, but today, hopefully I can encourage some practices that you will develop early in the fruit tree's life in order to reduce the amount of pruning cuts that you have to make later in the season or in the life of the tree. Now, with this goumi berry, I see a couple issues immediately offhand. The first being, we see a volunteer that has jumped in here. I think, this is important to realize because a lot of times when we have that competition, one of the two is going to win that battle ultimately. So since this is not part of the goumi berry, I want to get it out of here. And then I'm going to go through and look for both dead limbs and crossing branches. So we're going to make a couple pruning cuts here. All right, so now we've removed that sapling that was growing in the center here, that volunteer, and we've gotten the vine out of the plant. What I want to look out for next, again, are those dead and crossing branches. So if we look in the canopy here of this goumi berry, we do see some aggressive rubbing, and what happens over time, one of those two branches is always going to lose that battle because it will create an injury that breaks through the bark surface. And then that becomes a really wonderful hotbed for infection by wood decay organisms. So we want to reduce the amount of rubbing that we see. Now there's multiple options here that we have for crossing branches. So I'm going to start with those cross branches first, and then we'll do just a general thin on this and get a little bit more sunlight and air to penetrate in this canopy. Okay, so with pruning, a lot of times what's really, really important, and this is why teaching pruning is a challenge. It's not so much what you take out of the plant that's important, it's more important what you leave behind. We know that we're going to create small holes in the canopy through pruning, but if you can see through that plant and understand what that end product is going to look like, you'll have a much better success. Go ahead and pull this piece. Now, we often hear of the three-point cut, and the three-point cut is an ideal situation, especially for those of us that are really just starting pruning. Now, as you progress in your pruning career, of course, you'll learn the ways that you can hold branches in order to help reduce any potential tearing that could occur along that main branch. I'm going to get rid of that top piece. So when you guys are making cuts, if you see, that you can't necessarily get in for a three-point cut on a, 1/4 inch size limb like this, you can just gently lift so that it doesn't have any gravity fighting against it. We will. So three-point cut is just a technique that's utilized so that we reduce the chances of when you make that final cut, the actual branch dropping down and potentially tearing the bark all the way down the trunk. Once we do that, we set ourselves up for big problems. So generally cut out anywhere between 6 and 12 inches away from that branch collar. We'll expand on that in a moment. And you make a gentle undercut, a nice top cut, and then you can make your third final cut at the branch bark root. So we've removed all of the cross limbs that we found throughout the canopy. Of course, the sucker shoots that had arose from the base of the tree, and of course a little bit of a vine that we found. So next we're really going to move into kind of this holistic thinning of the entire plant. And what I'm going to do by that is just ultimately reduce the amount of foliage that's going to exist in this canopy once spring hits. And of course, that's going to allow greater sunlight penetration into the canopy, as well as a better chance for air to flow through and out of the plant. Because we know by doing those two things, we reduce insect and disease pressures. So, you know, what I'm going to do is just kind of generally starting at the base of an individual limb, I'll run up and I'll look for future problems. So any limbs that could potentially rub later in life, or those limbs that are aggressively growing just directly into the canopy or into a neighboring branch, can easily be culled off, creating a situation where we ultimately thin that limb, giving it more of this open center, if you will, here. Now that one doesn't need much pruning on it, it's fine. So this one kind of growing a little wonky in towards the center of the canopy there. Probably not an ideal situation and can give us some extra sunlight into the center. Get him here. That's going to be a potential cross limb later in life. Following each limb up. So if I've got a torn limb, I'm going to go ahead and make a good clean cut on that at the bud. And then from here, get this piece out of the walkway slightly. Got a little cross limb here for the future. Another one growing directly into a neighboring branch. Get rid of this. And in fact, so remember, pruning's also like a haircut. I know you've all heard that before. You know, you can take more off, but once you take those final cuts, they're gone forever. So over here, I started a little short here, but I realized that I actually do want to remove that whole limb. So we're going to do that. Still going to create more of a situation where we've got greater sunlight. Here again, we've got a little competition showing up here. A couple snips. There's another cross branch I missed from earlier. And now I'm going to go out. After we've done that, I'll go out to the ends of each of the limbs. And, you know, so weight and leverage is a good thing to reduce on our plants. You know, if I asked you to hold a brick at arm's length that was 10 pounds, you probably couldn't do it very long. And in essence, that's what our trees are doing all day long. So if we can reduce some of the weight that's out at the end of that branch, not only are we reducing overall weight, but again, we're creating pockets to let that wind escape the plant. So that's what I'm doing here, is just a little gentle thinning out at the ends of the tips of the limbs. And then we'll just kind of run all through this canopy until we're done. And then we hopefully can stand back and look at it and see where we're at. So out here at the tip again. Looked like it had a little damage on it. Okay, so we have moved over to another part of the yard here at Hope Central, and we're moving to a peach tree. Now, this is a peach tree that I know was planted in 2015, so it's roughly 6 years old at this stage. And interestingly, like many of our fruit trees here in East Tennessee, they get put in the ground and then they really are a secondary thought from there forward. So oftentimes we get to them and they are neglected. And that's certainly the case here. You know, with our fruit trees, if we can, we're going to start managing them from day one. The second we're putting that tree in the ground, we're going to start training that tree. Now with our stone fruit, so our peach, our plum, cherry, nectarines, we really want to encourage an open center system. And what that means is kind of, if you think of a crow's foot upside down, that's kind of what we want. We want 3 or 4 really healthy dominant branches that keep the center open, but still allow for abundant growth laterally out towards the edges. A main thoroughfare here to get to the parking lot. So you can see that there's numerous cuts that have been made over time. Now when you're pruning, keep that in mind, because a lot of times if they were once a problem, they're probably going to be a problem again in the future. So a lot of times while we're pruning, we can come in and fix those problems long term. Now that may not turn out best for the structure of the tree, but it at least allows us to reduce the chances of people coming out and just breaking branches or pruning them improperly. Now, I know I mentioned earlier an open center system on a lot of our stone fruit trees. So if you notice this central leader, you know, I really don't like this central leader in here. The good news is that we have a lot of really good filler limbs right around this area that will account for this cut. Now, here again, is this an ideal cut to make? Absolutely not. But this tree just wasn't managed from day number one. It never really developed 3 really nice scaffold branches. And it was just left to grow. So at this point, we're going to cull this center out first. We're going to create a big hole in the canopy. But in time, this will fill back in and we'll be able to better manage this. Now also, one of our volunteer foresters mentioned, well, don't you need to keep fruit where you can actually access the fruit? And 100% true. You know, if a tree's 12 foot tall, are you going to be able to come out and get the fruit without getting a ladder out? Keep in mind, a lot of our root stocks will say that they are dwarfing. Meaning that they are a smaller version of the parent tree. But if the parent tree was a 100-foot tree and it's a 20% dwarf, you know, you still have a lot of growth. You still can expect, you know, a 20, 25-foot tall tree. So that may be too much to manage, and we'll talk a little more on that once we get over to the apple tree. So I'm going to start with this big cut, get it out of here first, and then from there we'll move into more of the thinning. So with this cut, you know, only because, you know, I've pruned for a while now, I'm just gonna make a random cut. There's no rhyme or reason to why I selected here. I just really want to get into a location where I can still manage the limb. Now, a lot of times when we prune that 3-point cut, if you do your undercut, your back cut, you can almost just let the limb sit there and lift it off, you know, with ease afterwards. So making appropriate cuts really helps. And it creates a situation where you're being a little more safe than just cutting and letting it free fall over onto a neighboring shrub or branch or structure. So now I'll clean up this final cut. Okay, y'all, so this is a real hard cut because obviously there's no established branch bark ridge, right? We've all heard branch bark ridge, you know. The branch bark ridge is something that you know about, you read about in a textbook. It looks great, but when you get into the real world, a lot of times the branch bark ridge isn't so obvious. So at that point, we have to do our best, and we have to do our best in relation to what limbs are nearby. So I see a really good opportunity to make my final cut through here, but I don't see as good of an opportunity here. So it's important to not just pay attention to where you start your cut, but also where you're going to end that cut. So with this, I'm going to actually make just a bevel cut here. I'm going to go ahead and remove this dead limb first so I can have better access with my saw. And that's gone. And then I can get in here. Now I want to be as cautious as I can to not injure this limb, because this is what's going to fill out that side of the canopy. So again, just remember that, you know, when we're pruning fruit trees, it's vastly different than our ornamental trees. I tell people usually plant your ornamentals, leave them alone for 2 years, structure prune them at year 2, year 3, and then leave that tree alone. With fruit trees, that's not the case. You know, we have to aggressively prune these. We want to keep that shape over the long term. We want to remove dead limbs regularly. And we want to thin the canopy to reduce the amount of foliage. So I'm just getting little knickknacks, but now we've come out to a limb that we definitely want to preserve. Now I'm going to look immediately for any problems. So dead limbs, they can come off. The remaining limbs I clearly see buds on. We'll go ahead and plan to preserve those. Now I'm going to do just a little bit of thinning. There's a cross limb. We talked about that earlier. And now, since this is kind of a thoroughfare, I'm going to go ahead and make sure that we flatten the tree gently on this side. Obviously, we've had an injury there from old tear. We're going to go ahead and eliminate that for the future, so that's not a problem. We can still flatten this side just a little bit more, because keep in mind, what it looks like now is not what it's going to look like when it has a whole lot of fruit and foliage on it. So here again, a little bit of crowding. I want to eliminate that. I'm going to go up to the tip. Still going to eliminate, thin every other one. Not necessarily every other one, but a couple dead sprigs. Not so worried about those. Now we leave that behind for this year with plenty of buds still left on that twig. A little bit of a cross limb, we can snip him there. And now I'm just kind of getting some of these dead limbs out. So I wanted to talk a little bit about our pruning cuts. You know, a lot of times I go into homeowner settings and this is what I see, you know, someone that's just kind of snipped the ends of a branch off. It's very common and, you know, it's not the end of the world, but what oftentimes happens is when you make that pruning cut there, the tree has no ability to compartmentalize or close that injury. Instead, what winds up happening most often is that whole piece will die back to a dormant bud or a live lateral branch. So when you see these, not only are they, you know, problematic for the tree by allowing in those wood decaying organisms, but certainly at the wrong angle, they can even become a hazard because you can poke your eye or your head. So use a little bit of caution on these and generally just go ahead and make them back to that bud, and then you're able to preserve the limb and still accomplish the same goal. While pruning this peach tree, of course, we see a couple issues, you know, with the tree. Now, this is very common. We see this in a landscape setting. It's very commonplace, and a lot of times it can be as the result of, you know, weed whacker or string trimmer damage. But there can also be some issues with voles. Voles have a tendency to chew through a lot of our fruit tree roots as well. But this really kind of looks like some string trimmer damage to me. And the problem with this is once we break through that bark surface, ultimately we expose that internal wood to those wood decay organisms. Further, what we often see is the fact that we get the buildup of that moisture, and that moisture over time ultimately just rots as it continues to degrade. And if you look closely, I probably will be able to rock this whole tree in place. And you know, over time, that rot will, of course, spread throughout that trunk and leads to a premature death of the tree. So protect your trees. Keep the grass away from the tree trunk. That way you're not even getting in there and managing with a string trimmer. And just keep an eye on this situation. We want to be very cautious of our tree trunk and any bark surface that we have.
And Lee, looking at it now, it does look like the tree was planted too low to begin with.
Yeah, absolutely. So that is a good point. You know, we are a little low. It's hard to see really where that root flare starts, you know. But the one common theme that we do see is there's definitely a buildup of moisture right here. And that moisture touching the bark just long term is not going to work. So plant a little bit high if you're ever worried. You know, we can fix planting a tree too high. You know, you can add in a layer of mulch. You can bring in a small amount of topsoil. But once you plant a tree too deeply, there's very little that can be done from that point. Alrighty, on to our next tree. So again, we're still out here at Hope Central. We're on the final tree, which is a plum. And this is a tree that, again, kind of like everything else in the yard, has been planted, you know, 6-7 years ago and just been left to its own ways. Now, as a result of that, we know that plum is very problematic in getting what is known as black knot. And you've probably already seen that here. That's these large swells that we see oftentimes on the limbs. Now, later in the life of the black knot, a lot of times they'll actually even become infected by other secondary fungi that may lead to the white coloration or gray coloration. Now, black knot is widespread throughout the United States, and particularly here in the Southeast. In early spring, it'll start to develop about this time of year, maybe in another 3-4 weeks. And we'll start to see a little bit of swelling on the ends of the limbs. Now, of course, by late spring, they'll become a little bit softer. They'll almost be fleshy. And at that point, when you see them as fleshy bumps, they're actually producing spores. And those spores are immediately going to inoculate the new tender growth that comes off of the black plum. Now,
The black knot.
What's that?
The black knot.
I'm sorry, the black knot. I'm sorry, thank you, the black knot. So then beyond that, of course, we move into summer and they'll start to darken, they'll elongate as we see here. And then by fall, of course, they'll become hard and brittle. You know, we can't do anything to this. So at this stage, you know, we have a tree that's severely infested with, you know, black knot. So in general, black knot can be managed, but it's primarily managed through preventative fungicides and a really strong pruning regimen, something that has not happened here. And to show support for that, I want to walk into the tree. And if we were to cut this tree, you know, almost in half, we see that black knot has occurred primarily on the house side of the tree. And what you notice is that's where the greatest amount of sunlight does not reach. But if we look at the front side of the tree, there's a very low occurrence of black knot out here. And that's as a result of it being in full sun. Now with our fruit trees, again, we really want that early morning sun hitting that canopy as quick as we can to help dry any condensation that's formed overnight. So we're gonna work aggressively on this tree. We're gonna thin it, we're gonna get more sunlight in, and then we're just gonna kind of let it sit for a year or two. And if we have to implement a spray regimen, we can talk through that at a certain point. If you need any specific recommendations, you can reach out to me. I'll be happy to provide my email at the end of this presentation. So the recommendation when we're pruning out black knot, you know, obviously if we have a limb like this that has over a foot, you know, 18 inches worth of black knot along the stem, certainly we're going to go ahead and make a good clean arborist cut back there. But if we have just a small canker that's kind of developed along the stem, you can generally go back to a live branch about 2 to 4 inches away from that black knot. And then you can hopefully preserve that limb. Now, this tree is definitely in need of some management, and we're just gonna kind of play it by ear this year and see what it looks like next. All right, we've wrapped up out here at Hope Central today. Thank you all for joining us. This is our plum, completely finished with the prune. I've done about all I want to do for one single year's worth of cutting, but as you can see, we've opened that center a good deal. We've eliminated at least 80% of the black knot that can be found throughout the canopy. We've gotten it off the sidewalk, the neighboring property, and of course the house as well. So now we just look forward to seeing what this thing does over the next few years. Certainly getting on a spray regimen is going to help this tree, but for right now, we're just going to try and manage it through proper pruning practices and cultural recommendations. And one of those that I did not mention earlier, to help control the spread of black knot, we want to keep this area beneath the tree as clean as we can. As leaf debris starts to fall, small twigs, go ahead and get those out of this system so we reduce the chances of an inoculum staying over winter and reinfecting the tree year after year. Thanks again, everybody. Have a great rest of your week.